Outsiders don't need to come to the funeral. On the night of the wake for the kind father-in-law who had passed away, my mother-in-law who had left all the responsibility of caring for him to my husband and me, said this. What? Since it's a family ceremony, please refrain if you're not family. And besides, Dad's $3 million inheritance is ours. Surprised by Judy's words, my husband asked again. Daniel, Judy, what are you talking about? It's Dad's funeral. And $3 million. Then, with a sigh of annoyance, the mother-in-law said, the youngest like you won't get a penny. Just renounce your inheritance. That's absurd. Now is not the time to talk about inheritance. Agitated, my husband protested, and I continued in a tearful voice. Right. Please, let us say a proper goodbye to Dad. The mother-in-law glared at me. Why are you, an outsider, acting like family? Come to think of it, Dad did ask the nurse to call you at the end. Did you have something going on with Dad? Daniel and Judy were dramatically disgusted. Ew, gross. Were you eyeing Dad for his inheritance? Scott, you married a terrible woman. I clenched my fists, enraged by their cruel treatment of my husband and kind father-in-law, and finally suspected of infidelity. Such despicable people. I took a deep breath and said calmly, I understand. We won't attend the funeral. My name is Christina. I'm 35 years old. Scott and I met through a coworker, dated, and eventually got married. I work as a bank teller, and my husband works for a multinational company. Despite our busy lives, we enjoy our time together. Scott, you're bringing your dad's clothes, right? Yes, that's right. Thank you, Christina. Since we both had the day off, Scott and I went to the hospital where the father-in-law was admitted. Scott, Christina. Thank you for coming today. He noticed us and smiled as he sat up slowly. Last year, he suffered a stroke and has since been paralyzed on his right side, struggling through rehabilitation in the hospital. It's getting quite cold, so make sure to stay warm. Thank you. And you too, don't catch a cold either. The father-in-law responded to my husband, who spoke kindly to him. While listening to their exchange, I changed his clothes. Christina, Scott. I'm sorry for all this trouble I've caused. Don't worry about it, Dad. It's what we should do. Exactly, just let us know if there's anything else we can do. As we were enjoying a peaceful moment, the door to the room burst open. It was the mother-in-law, brother-in-law Daniel, and sister-in-law Judy. The mother-in-law, who stormed noisily into the hospital room, said insincerely upon noticing us, Oh. And who might this be? Scott, and, what was your name again? Seizing the opportunity, Daniel and Judy eagerly continued. Mom, that's too harsh. Even if she's just a burden of a wife. Right. It's Kristen, right? Judy snickered condescendingly. I couldn't respond, just remained silent. Even after 5 years of marriage, they had never once spoken kindly to us. Hey. Mom, Daniel, Judy. I can take it, but don't be rude to Christina. Defending me as I looked down, my husband spoke irritably. The mother-in-law sighed and shrugged her shoulders, saying, Oh, come on. Why are you so angry? It's just a joke, laugh it off. There's a limit to jokes. I've always thought. Scott began, but the mother-in-law cut him off. That doesn't matter. We're going to have a family discussion now. So you outsiders should leave. What? Family? I am family too. Scott protested, but Daniel dismissively waved him off. You're too presumptuous for the youngest who can't do anything. Just leave. Judy laughed derisively and said, Right. You're just in the way. Despite feeling crushed, my gentle husband took my hand. Let's go home, he said with a pained voice, and I squeezed his hand in return. We said bye to the father-in-law, who looked troubled, and left the room. On the way home, Scott held my hand tightly and said with a choked voice, Christina, I'm really sorry. My family keeps saying such disrespectful things. I smiled at my husband as he apologized. Don't worry about it. The one who's really hurt is you. Upon hearing my words, my husband's face crumpled as if he was about to cry. He was born the youngest of 3 siblings. While his mother doted on his older brother Daniel and sister Judy, she was indifferent to him. As a child, she never once attended any school. Events like class observations or sports days that he participated in, she would buy anything his siblings asked for, but always ignored his requests. The clothes and toys he received were hand-me-downs from his older siblings, always worn out. From a young age, he had resigned himself to the futility of asking for anything. Furthermore, even the tuition for high school was reluctantly provided. He was constantly told, "You'll work after middle school." Despite the poor academic performance of his siblings, who were sent to private universities, his mother refused to pay any of his tuition fees. However, because he was a good student, he attempted to take out student loans. But upon learning this, his father helped out and paid for him to attend a relatively affordable state university. Thanks to this, he was able to work at the company where he is employed today. Even when we went to greet his family upon our decision to marry, his mother showed no interest in us. She never asked my name and spoke with apparent disinterest. Do as you please. With those dismissive words, she didn't even bother to offer us coffee, clearly wanting us to leave quickly. Instead, Daniel and Judy sneered down at me. To think someone would marry such a man. Really, though. She must be quite the odd one. My husband has always been treated as a nuisance and a burden by his family. Even after our marriage, nothing changed. And we were never invited to family weddings or memorial services. Relatives who didn't know any better would often ask us why we hadn't attended, blaming us. No matter how cold they were to me, Dad was always on my side. My husband murmured softly. His father, often away due to work when he was young, wasn't home much. Nevertheless, he always made sure to provide presents for events like Christmas and birthdays. His mother never did anything like that. But my husband was content. Despite his busy schedule, he would take time off work to attend his graduation, something he still happily talks about today. It was only the father-in-law who smiled and congratulated us on our marriage. He always cared about me too, always greeting me with a smile. However, even he was coldly referred to as nothing more than an ATM by his family after he fell ill, and they treated him harshly. That's why we willingly took on the task of caring for him. Scott, I will always cherish you and your father. Hearing this, my husband smiled bashfully. Gently picking up my hand, he said, Thank you always. I'm sorry for the trouble. A few months later, we received a call from the hospital. Your father-in-law has had another stroke. We rushed there. But by the time we arrived, the father-in-law had already passed away. Dad, I wanted to do more for you. Dad. Dad. My husband cried out loudly as he looked at his father, now peacefully at rest. The words the father-in-law had spoken to me. And his smiling face flashed through my mind. And before I knew it, I was crying with big tears. When the mother-in-law, Daniel, and Judy arrived, they showed no tears and seemed rather in good spirits. We've arranged the funeral. You handle the troublesome parts, she said dismissively, pushing a funeral service brochure onto my husband. And then leaving promptly. We were stunned, but then realized. We have to properly send off your dad. We immediately contacted the funeral home to arrange the wake and funeral. A few days later, after the wake went smoothly and the mourners had left, I spoke to the mother-in-law, now in mourning clothes. I want to discuss the arrangements for tomorrow's funeral. Oh, just ask the funeral director, everything's taken care of. Then she said something unbelievable. You outsiders don't need to come to tomorrow's funeral. Excuse me? What? My husband and I asked at the same time. Seeing our reaction, Daniel smirked and opened his mouth. Thanks for your hard work with the caregiving. But now you're dismissed. Don't show up at the funeral tomorrow. What are you talking about? Explain yourself. As I spoke with a trembling voice, shaken by the situation, Judy quickly interjected. It's obvious. Did you really think you could attend? The funeral is a family ceremony. It's none of your business, you outsiders. Stay away. And the $3 million inheritance, we're taking it. Frustrated, my husband asked back. Daniel, Judy, what are you talking about? It's Dad's funeral. This is no time for jokes. And $3 million. The mother-in-law lazily shook her head. Dad was a high earner, and we come from a wealthy family. So there's a lot of inheritance. Just so you know, you should renounce your inheritance. There's nothing for the youngest. What are you saying? Who cares about inheritance right now? Continuing after my husband, I said, trying to hold back tears. Scott is right. Please let us say goodbye to him. But the mother-in-law glared at me sharply. What are you doing acting like family? Ah, that's right, at the end. Dad asked the nurse to call you, didn't he? That's because we were always the ones taking care of him. As I answered, Daniel and Judy exaggeratedly grimaced. You were having an affair with Dad, weren't you? Disgusting. The worst. You were probably eyeing inheritance, weren't you? You were just caregiving for the money, right? Scott, you've been deceived. What are you talking about? Christina is. As my husband raised his voice in anger, the mother-in-law quickly interjected. I don't even want to call such a despicable daughter-in-law who cheats with her husband's father, and this nuisance of a youngest son, family. Leave now and never appear before us again. Enough. Christina has been earnestly caring for Dad. How can you say such things? I bit my lip hard. To be treated so poorly by these people. Suspected of infidelity with the kind father-in-law. I was beyond angry. Taking a deep breath, I said in a low voice. Scott, that's enough. Glaring at the mother-in-law and others, I continued. I understand what you all are saying. We won't attend the funeral. Hearing this, my husband replied in a calm voice. Yeah. I don't want to consider people who mock us like this family. We'll pay respects to Dad at his grave. With that, we left the place after paying respects to the father-in-law. 2 days later, the mother-in-law called my cell phone. I told my husband. And it seemed she had called him as well. Don't answer. Let's just ignore it. As I was hesitating about whether to answer the phone, Scott said that, so I didn't pick up at all. However, the calls from the mother-in-law were persistent and daily. A week later, when I was thinking about blocking her due to the incessant calls, the mother-in-law, along with Daniel and Judy, suddenly visited our apartment. "What do you want now?" Scott asked, arms crossed, as the restless mother-in-law started accusing us rapidly. "What do you mean by this? The inheritance from Dad, all of it yours? I wasn't told about this." Hearing this, Scott responded firmly. "Oh, that's what this is about." A lawyer came to us too, and we heard everything. It was the day after the funeral. A lawyer visited us and informed us that the father-in-law had left a will. The will stated that all his inheritance should be transferred to us, and we had already started the process to receive it. You thought you'd naturally get the inheritance because you're family, right? Normally, you'd definitely receive a mandatory portion, wouldn't you? That's right. And yet, all the inheritance is going to Scott and his. We're told we don't qualify for any of it. As the mother-in-law was panicking, her face turning bright red and becoming agitated, Scott and I calmly stated, "Of course. My father-in-law had requested the lawyer to disinherit you, ensuring you wouldn't get the inheritance. If you're disinherited, you can't even receive the minimum reserved portion." Then Daniel leaned forward, raising his voice. "Yeah, that's it. What does disinheritance mean? I can't accept this." "Daniel, I heard you were always saying horrible things like calling Dad useless and telling him to get a job when he needed care." Scott glared at attacking Daniel and spoke in a low voice. "That's not. Moreover, it seems you've been misusing Dad's bank deposits. That's reason enough for disinheritance. Why do you guys know that? Your father left a letter with the lawyer for us. It was all written there." As Daniel panicked, I calmly stated. Then Judy interjected. "But still, it's not fair for you two to take everything. I need money too." However, Scott shook his head in dismay at such a sister. "Judy, you've been heavily misusing money and have a habit of debt, right? On the day we were driven out of the hospital room, you even made Dad pay off your debts." "That's right. Forcing someone to take over your debts is also a reason for disinheritance." As Scott and I pressed on, Judy was at a loss for words. Silence fell over Daniel and Judy. Seeing this, the impatient mother-in-law shouted, "What? The nuisance youngest. Don't get cocky." Amidst the resounding insults, Scott said calmly, "Just to say, the worst one is Mom. She's been cheating for years, while Dad was on solo assignments, doing whatever she wanted." "What? That's not." Daniel and Judy, with eyes wide open, stared at the mother-in-law. I sighed and said, "Did you two not know? You underestimated kind Dad, didn't you? Dad gathered evidence beforehand and prepared everything so it would reach us and the lawyer." Scott frowned and scornfully continued looking at the mother-in-law. "If a spouse has been cheating for many years, you can disinherit them. Didn't you know that? Accusing me and Dad of an affair during the wake was because you were cheating yourself, right? Otherwise, you wouldn't have thought of such an idea." Under our relentless words, the mother-in-law's face twisted rapidly. Then, turning pale, she could only tremble her lips. "You really thought you could do whatever you wanted and still get the inheritance? Thinking you could regret it now is too late." With anger seeping through, Scott spat those words out, and Daniel miserably clung to him. Hey, Scott. Please, I'm begging you, just give me a little bit of the inheritance. I need money because I failed at investing. There must be a lot left, right? Following Daniel, Judy collapsed to the floor as if she were about to prostrate herself. Her face, messed up from tears, she rubbed against Scott's feet, clinging to him. I'm sorry for everything that's happened. Please forgive me. If it turns out that I have debts, I'll be divorced. Scott looked down disdainfully at Daniel and Judy, displaying their disgraceful behavior. I will never forget how you treated me and Dad. Don't expect forgiveness. As he trembled with clenched fists, watching this scene, the mother-in-law furrowed her brows and raised her voice. Do you really think it's okay to abandon your family like this? You know what will happen. Hearing the pitiful cries of the mother-in-law, I inadvertently let out a what? Scott. And I looked at each other and spoke together. Family? Please don't make me laugh. Weren't you the ones who first called us outsiders? There's no way we would help outsiders like you. You're just facing the consequences of your actions. With Scott's final words, we locked out the three of them. It was a hassle to push out the three who were desperately clinging. But with the help of the building manager who heard the commotion, we managed to send them away. The expressions on the mother-in-law's face as they left were completely worn out, showing none of the spiteful features they had before. After the three left, our apartment returned to silence, and Scott slowly pulled me close as I let out a deep sigh. Soon after, we received the inheritance from the father-in-law. To avoid any further trouble from them, we moved immediately, and even put a lock on our family register. Finally, peaceful days arrived. From what relatives told me, Daniel had resorted to borrowing money from consumer finance and loan sharks to cover his failed investments. Now overwhelmed with debt, he is trembling with dread from collection calls, working at a factory and living a meager life. Judy, discovered by her husband to have a debt problem, was divorced. She returned to her parents' home without a decent job, living a life far from her previous glamorous one. She was turned away from night jobs and is barely managing her increasing debts with a part-time job. The mother-in-law's affair partner turned out to be a married man. Naturally, his wife found out and demanded a large amount of compensation. The mother-in-law, now greatly aged, could not find a new lover and lives in a shabby apartment, struggling even for daily meals. But that is no longer our concern. Meanwhile, freed from worries, Scott was promoted to department head at work. We also had a beautiful daughter, and I am spending my days as a stay-at-home mom. Remembering the kindness of the father-in-law, I pour a lot of love into our daughter. We plan to continue living these warm days with Scott and our daughter. The mother-in-law, Daniel, and Judy were selfish and despicable people. It's a miracle how Scott turned out to be such a decent person. I'm truly glad that the father-in-law was on our side. Despite their horrendous actions, like calling him useless or demanding he work while sick, making him pay debts, or cheating for years, they still thought they were entitled to the inheritance. It's just too shameless. It's good that the inheritance didn't end up in the hands of those devils, thanks to the father-in-law, who properly arranged the disinheritance.